Dark blood traced the grout lines of Trauma Bay 3 like a map of somewhere terrible. A 4-star general in dress greens filled the doorway, his chest a geography of combat ribbons, and his voice was loud enough to rattle the IV bags on their hooks. I want the best trauma surgeon in this building, not the second best, not whoever's available, the best. General Arnold Flint had been given 3 different answers in the past 4 minutes, and none of them had been acceptable. His son, Army Ranger Sergeant First Class Mason Flint, lay on the gurney behind him, pale as poured concrete, soaked through his field dressings, his oxygen numbers dropping in slow, merciless increments on the monitor overhead. A live ordnance training exercise at Fort Campbell had gone catastrophically sideways. A shaped charge had detonated 12 feet from where Mason was standing. The blast had thrown him 20 feet. An embedded shrapnel in his left side, collapsing his lung and doing something to the space around his heart that the flight medic hadn't been able to fully identify mid-transport. Dr. Sutton is the chief of trauma surgery, the charge nurse said carefully, keeping her voice steady the way people do around large, frightened animals. He's in OR 2 right now, with an open abdominal aorta he cannot scrub out. Then get me whoever comes next. The senior resident, not a resident. Flint's jaw locked. Not a student, not someone who learned this on a mannequin. I want someone who's actually done this before. The monitors above Mason's gurney began to shriek. The room shifted. Every nurse and resident turned toward the sound, and through that turning parted a narrow corridor of space, just long enough for the woman who stepped through the side door to move through it without breaking stride. She wore navy scrubs and no expression worth reading. Her dark hair was pulled back in a knot that had been tight 8 hours ago and had been maintained purely through stubbornness since then. She was 34 years old and carried herself like someone who had done difficult things in worse places than this. Her name badge read, Kinnear B. Trama Nursey. What do we have, she said. It wasn't a question. The charge nurse began reading from the flight sheet. Blythe Kinnear had already moved past her, gloved hands reading Mason's vitals with the kind of attention that bypassed the chart entirely. Diminished breath sounds on the left. Tracheal deviation. The dressings on his lateral chest wall were soaked through in layers, and when she pressed 2 fingers carefully below his clavicle, Mason's eyelids flickered, and his blood pressure dropped another 4 points in real time. Pneumothorax, she said, and his heart sounds are distant. I want a bedside echo. You're a nurse. General Flint had moved. He was standing directly behind her now, close enough that she could smell the starch in his uniform. Blythe didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Mason. Yes, sir. Where is the surgeon? In an operating room saving someone else's life. She kept her voice level. Right now I'm the senior clinical person in this bay. If you'd like to call hospital administration and argue the org chart while your son's lung finishes collapsing, I'll wait. Flint grabbed her shoulder. She stepped laterally, not away from the gurney but around it, taking the grab with her, neutralizing it without drama, without looking up. Don't do that again. I need both hands. The echo wand was already in her right one. The image materialized on the screen. Blythe stared at it for 3 seconds, and something in her face went very still. He's tamponating, she said quietly. There's fluid around the heart. His pericardial sac is filling. She looked up then, not at Flint, but at the charge nurse. Page Sutton's OR. Tell him I need him on the phone in 60 seconds. and get me a pericardiocentesis tray and a 14-gauge needle. Now." The room moved, everyone except Flint. He was staring at her, not at his son, not at the monitor, at her. At the faint scar that ran in a thin arc from her left jaw to just below her ear. At the way she held herself, spine straight, weight on her back heel, like someone who had learned stillness in places where flinching got people killed. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the back of General Arnold Flint's memory, a sound like that buzzing became the thwop of rotor blades and the distant concussive percussion of incoming mortar fire. FOB Salerno, Coast Province, Afghanistan, 3 years ago. He had walked into that forward aid station looking for Colonel Dennis Frazer, his most trusted officer, the man he had commanded for 6 years across 2 theaters of war. What he had found instead was a woman in blood-soaked ACUs moving between cots in a tent that smells of burning and copper. The same way this room smelled now, triaging a row of wounded soldiers with the mechanical calm of someone who had stopped feeling anything except the math. Frazer had been on one of those cots. She had been the one to tell him, afterward, that Frazer was gone. He had seen her face then, the same face. "You," Flint said. The word came out very quiet. The quiet was worse than the shouting. Blythe had already turned back to the gurney. The pericardiocentesis tray had appeared at her elbow. She was drawing up lidocaine with one hand while the other kept 2 fingers on Mason's pulse. "You were at Salerno," Flint said. "You're the medic from Salerno. You let Dennis Frazer die on a cot while you were stitching up privates." "I remember you, General," Blythe said. Her voice didn't change, not a fraction. "And I don't have time for this conversation. You're not touching my son." She looked at him then, full eye contact. Her eyes were an unusual shade of brown, almost amber, and they had the quality of someone who was very tired and very sure of themselves at exactly the same time. "Look at the monitor," she said. He looked. The numbers were not good. "His heart is being squeezed by its own blood, General. In approximately 2 minutes, it stops. When it stops in a trauma like this, it doesn't restart." She had the needle in her hand. "You can spend those 2 minutes telling me who I am and what I did and what you're going to do about it. Or you can let me work and give your son a fighting chance. That is the only choice on the table right now." Flint stood rigid. The monitors screamed. He looked at his son's face. Mason had his mother's jaw, a detail Flint had noticed when Mason was 3 days old and had never stopped noticing. Mason's mother had been gone 11 years. The jaw was all that was left. He stepped back. Blythe didn't waste a second. She found the subxiphoid notch by touch, angled the needle at 45 degrees, and advanced it slowly, watching the echo screen as she went. The moment the tip entered the pericardial space, dark blood flashbacked into the syringe, 20, 30, 40 milliliters. Mason's blood pressure began to climb. The room collectively exhaled. "He's stabilizing." The resident was watching the monitor with barely concealed relief. "BP's coming up, 80/50, 980. Don't celebrate." Blythe drew off another 20 milliliters. "This is temporizing. The source of the bleeding is still in there. He needs OR2 the second Sutton's patient is closed." She turned to the charge nurse. "What's Sutton's ETA?" "He's on the phone." The handset appeared at her ear. Dr. Grant Sutton's voice was clipped and focused, the voice of a man simultaneously speaking to her and continuing to work with his hands. "Kinnear, talk. Blast injury, left lateral chest, hemopneumothorax, cardiac tamponade. I drained the pericardial sac. He's stable for now, but the bleed isn't controlled. Where are you? 30 minutes, minimum. My patient isn't closable yet. A pause. The sound of instruments in the background. If he reaccumulates before I get there. I know. You've seen an ED thoracotomy. I've done one, Grant, in a firebase outside Kandahar, with a headlamp and a field kit. I know what it asks. A longer pause. I can walk you through it, Sutton said carefully, if it comes to that. Let's hope it doesn't. It came to that. 14 minutes later, Mason's pressure crashed without warning. Systolic of 40, then 30, then the monitor flatlined into a continuous scream. The pericardial sac had refilled faster than anyone had calculated, and this time a needle was not going to be enough. Blythe looked at the monitor. She looked at Mason's face. She thought, briefly, about what she was about to do, and about what it would cost her, and about the fact that none of that mattered. Sutton, she said into the phone, I'm cracking his chest. Understood. I'll walk you through every cut. General Flint surged forward. Absolutely not. She is a nurse. She is not authorized. She's the only person in that room who can save your son right now. Sutton's voice came through the handset clearly enough that everyone in the bay could hear it. She has more hands-on combat trauma experience than half my surgical residents. General, I am authorizing this procedure under my license. If you physically interfere, your son dies on that table in the next 90 seconds. That is not a figure of speech. Flint stood rigid, every instinct in him fighting itself. He looked at Mason. He looked at Blythe's hands sit steady, waiting, not performing patience, but actually possessing it. Do it, he said. His voice broke on the second word. Please. Blythe was already calling for the thoracotomy tray. The scalpel was cold in her hand. She had held scalpels before. Not in operating rooms, but in helicopter bays, in forward aid stations, in the dark with her headlamp dying. She had learned to operate not because she wanted to be a surgeon, but because sometimes surgeons were gone, and the alternative was watching someone leave the world while she stood there with her hands at her sides. Sutton guided her from 30 minutes away. His voice was precise and calm in a way that had nothing to do with the situation being calm. The incision, the rib spreaders, the crunch of cartilage giving way was something she had learned not to let reach her face. Then the pericardium, bulging and taut. She made the window, the dark blood erupted, and Mason's heart, freed of its compression, gave a violent, grateful heave and began to beat. Heart's beating, the resident said. And his voice was the voice of someone very young who had just watched something they would spend the rest of their career trying to understand. Stay with me, Kinnear. Sutton's voice. Find the source. Her fingers found it. A shrapnel fragment had nicked the intercostal artery along the underside of the third rib, small enough to miss on the transport imaging, large enough to have been killing him the entire time. She clamped it. Clamped, she said. Good, hold it. I'm closing now. 12 minutes. Don't let go. She didn't let go. General Flint watched her from the corner of the room. He had stopped trying to intervene. He wasn't sure exactly when he had stopped. Somewhere between the moment the scalpel touched his son's skin and the moment Mason's heart lurched back to life on its own, he stood with his back against the wall. Not a position General Arnold Flint was accustomed to. And he watched this woman hold his son's artery shut with her bare hand. She was sweating. Her jaw was tight with the sustained effort, but her hands were not shaking. Her hands were not shaking at all. When Grant Sutton arrived, coat abandoned somewhere in the corridors, scrubs thrown on over his dress shirt. He stopped 2 feet inside the bay doors and took in the scene with surgeon's eyes. "Hell of a thing, Kinnear," he said softly. "Suture the artery and tell me that later," she said. He did. The knots went in fast and clean. He tied off the bleeder, assessed the chest cavity, confirmed nothing else was hemorrhaging, and the pressure held. "You can release," Sutton said. Blythe slowly withdrew her hands from Mason Flint's chest. She took 1 step back, her legs held, just barely. Mason's vitals were climbing towards something that resembled survivable. "Or 1 now," Sutton said, already taking command of the gurney. "Wash out the cavity, stabilize those ribs, full CT to rule out anything we missed." He glanced at Blythe. "Go clean up. You kept a man alive." She stood in the center of the bay after they had wheeled Mason out. The adrenaline let go all at once, the way it always did. Like a tide going out faster than it came in. Her hands started shaking only after there was nothing left to hold. 20 minutes later, clean scrubs, the blood scrubbed from her forearms. Blythe walked into the surgical waiting area on the 3rd floor. She had done this walk 100 times. From the controlled chaos of the ER into the suffocating quiet of the room where people sat with their fear and had nowhere to put it. General Flint was alone. He was sitting in a plastic chair that seemed designed specifically to demean anyone who had to use it. His hat was on the seat beside him. Without it, and without the fury that had animated him downstairs, he looked like what he was. A man who had come very close to losing the last person in the world he could not afford to lose. He heard her footsteps and looked up. "Dr. Sutton says the surgery is going well," Blythe said, keeping her distance respectful. "The shrapnel nicked an intercostal artery, not a cardiac vessel. Mason is young and fit. He'll need chest PT for weeks and months of recovery, but he should have full function." Flint let out a breath that seemed to have been held since Fort Campbell. The silence lasted a moment. Then, "I tried to have you prosecuted." Blythe said nothing. "After Salerno, I filed a formal complaint. Demanded a court-martial. They reviewed the triage records and told me the decisions were medically sound, that Dennis was expectant by any clinical measure. I didn't accept that. I pulled strings. I made calls." He looked at his hands. "And then you resigned your commission. I know what you did, General. I know you know." His voice was rough. "What I don't know is why you didn't fight back. You had the records. You had witnesses. You could have defended yourself at the review." Blythe crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. She let the quiet sit, long enough that he would know her answer mattered to her before she gave it. "Because of what Colonel Frazer asked me to do," she finally said. "Not just at Salerno, afterward." Flint's head came up, the first crack in his armor. "What are you talking about?" She reached into the pocket of her scrub jacket and brought out a folded piece of paper, small, worn at the creases, the kind of wear that comes from being carried somewhere close to the body for a long time. She held it out. He took it. It was a photograph, military ID size. Dennis Frazer in his dress uniform, the kind they took before deployment. On the back, in handwriting Flint recognized without having to think, 6 words. "Tell Arnold it was my call." Flint's hand closed around it. He stood up. "He wrote this." "He wrote it at Salerno," Blythe said. "Before the investigation started. He gave it to me and said to keep it until you were ready to hear what actually happened." She turned to face the window at the end of the hall, because watching someone's face when they receive a certain kind of news felt like an intrusion. When they brought Colonel Frazer in, he was conscious. He could see what we had. 3 units of blood, 1 functioning surgical kit, a tent with half its poles blown out. He could see the row of wounded junior soldiers next to him. He had done field triage before. He knew what expectant looked like, and he did the math himself before I had finished doing mine. She stopped. He looked at me and he said, "Lieutenant Kinnear, those kids have got 20 years on me. Use the blood on them." She heard Flint sit back down heavily behind her. I argued with him. I told him I could manage both if we moved fast enough. "He outranked you," Flint said. His voice had gone strange, hollowed out. "He outranked me, and he knew exactly what he was doing with that." She turned back. "I held his hand when he went. He asked me not to tell you what he'd done. He said he knew you'd try to carry it, and that you'd been carrying enough for long enough already." She paused. He said, "If you'd been in that tent, you would have tried to override the order. That you would have spent every last unit of blood trying to save him, and lost all 6 of those boys in the process. He didn't want that on you." Flint was looking at the photograph. His jaw was working. "He kept me in the dark," he said, "to protect me." That's what he said. He called it a last order. She kept her voice even. He said the junior soldiers were his to send home. For a long moment there was no sound in the waiting room but the hum of the overhead lights and, somewhere far below, the distant wail of a siren. General Arnold Flint, who had commanded operations across 3 countries, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and had never, in Blythe Kinnear's observation, looked anything less than fully armored, pressed both hands over his face and stayed there. She gave him that. She kept her distance and gave him the time he needed. When he finally lowered his hands, his eyes were red. He held the photograph carefully, the way people hold things that have weight beyond their materials. "I tried to destroy your career," he said. "You did a decent job of it," she said, with enough quiet honesty that it wasn't cruelty. "You should have shown me this. It wasn't mine to show before now. Frazer told me when to give it." She looked at him steadily. "I didn't know it would look like this, but I think he understood that you'd eventually need to stop hating someone for a decision that was entirely his." Flint nodded, once slowly, the way a man nods when receiving a verdict he has been fighting for 3 years and has finally run out of ways to dispute. The waiting room doors opened. Sutton came through them still in his surgical cap, carrying it in one hand now, looking exhausted and quietly triumphant in the way of surgeons who have won something worth winning. "He's out," Sutton said. "Clean chest cavity, ribs stabilized, vitals rock solid. If I know Rangers, he'll be complaining about the jello before I finish my post-op notes. You can see him in about 45 minutes, General." Flint stood. He was a tall man, and the plastic chair had not dignified him, but standing he was again what he was, only altered in some way that Blythe thought probably would not reverse. He looked at Sutton and said, "Thank you, Doctor." Then he looked at Blythe. He stood straight. He squared his shoulders. His right hand came up, clean, deliberate, the kind of salute that meant something specific to the people who gave and received them. "Lieutenant Kinnear," he said, using her old rank the way he would use someone's true name, "I owe you an apology that is 3 years overdue, and I owe you my son." Blythe did not return the salute. She was not Army anymore. She hadn't been for 2 years. She nodded, once, the way you acknowledge something true. "Go see him, General," she said. "He's got a hard road. He'll want to know his father's there." The board meeting convened 3 days later in a glass-walled conference room on the executive floor of Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The room smelled of expensive diffuser oil and acute institutional anxiety. The hospital's risk officer, Edgar Banning, careful suit, careful face, had prepared a document summarizing Blythe Kinnear's licensing violations with the thoroughness of someone who understood that thoroughness was the only protection left to him. The state nursing board representative sat beside him with an expression arranged into professional gravity. Blythe sat at one end of the table in her charcoal blazer and said very little. Because she had learned a long time ago that certain rooms did not need her voice. They needed her stillness. Grant Sutton sat beside her and said plenty, with precision and a controlled anger he did not bother to conceal, and with the specific authority of a man holding department chair who was not remotely afraid of risk management offices. The procedure was authorized under his license. He had been present by phone throughout. The patient had survived a tamponade that would have killed him inside 2 minutes without intervention. The alternative to Blythe Kinnear's actions was a documented death. The clinical reasoning was filed. Banning said liability 5 times in 4 minutes. The doors opened. General Arnold Flint walked in with 2 Army Judge Advocate General officers, and a document bearing the Department of the Army seal, which he placed in the center of the table without ceremony and without sitting down. This contains a formal statement from Army Medical Command regarding Lieutenant Kinnear's clinical actions, fully consistent with her documented training as a combat trauma specialist, he said, in the voice he used when he was not asking. It also contains a formal request that this institution take no adverse action against her. That request carries the weight of the United States Army's interest in maintaining its research and medical partnerships with this hospital. He let that settle. He looked at Banning, then at the nursing board representative. I expect to hear before the end of the business day that Ms. Kinnear's record is clean and her employment is confirmed. He left without sitting down. The room was quiet for a long moment. The nursing board representative looked at the document, then at Blythe. Something in his expression shifted. Not admiration exactly, but the recognizable recalibration of someone who had walked into a room expecting one situation and found an entirely different one. I think, he said carefully, we can consider this matter resolved. 5 months later, Trauma Bay 3 was the same as it always was. Too bright, too loud, carrying its permanent undertone of antiseptic and urgency. Blythe had just finished a double shift and was charting at the nurse's station with the specific fatigue of someone who has been running on competence long after the energy ran out. She heard the doors and looked up. Mason Flint walked in on his own 2 feet. He moved carefully. The careful movement of someone recently reminded that the body is not invincible, but he was upright and steady, and the color was back in his face. Beside him, 1 step behind, in the deliberate way of a man trying to take up less space than usual, was his father. Heard you might be on tonight, Mason said. He had his father's directness and something else entirely, something quieter, more uncertain. My PT says I'm at 92% lung capacity, working back up. That sounds like something you're going to try to outpace, Blythe said. A corner of his mouth moved, probably. He looked at her the way people look at someone who has done something for them that doesn't fit inside ordinary categories of gratitude. He extended his hand, formal and genuine, a soldier's handshake. She took it. Flint met her eyes over his son's shoulder. There were things between them that had no clean language, and neither of them attempted to put it into any. He nodded. She nodded back. They left, and Blythe sat back down and picked up her pen. Another siren was already building in the distance, that particular rising pitch she had learned to read from a block away, the one that meant someone was coming in fast and bad and needed everything she had. She capped her pen and stood. There was always another one coming. That had been the hardest thing to learn, and then, eventually, the only thing that made any of it make sense. You could not save them all, and you could not stop trying, and the whole of the job lived in the space between those two facts. She walked toward the doors to meet it.